What's the worst wedding you've ever been to? My boss at the bakery was too drunk on the job to deliver a wedding cake and begged me to do it even though I only work in the back. He said this couple was lawsuit happy and had already threatened to sue over the cake tasting, so everything had to be perfect. I pulled up to the venue with the 3-tier monstrosity in my van and could already hear shouting from the parking lot. Through the windows, I could see the bride in her dress screaming at someone while the groom threw his hands up and stormed off. I sat in my van for 5 minutes hoping things would calm down, but more people started yelling and someone threw a centerpiece against the wall. The cake needed to be set up in 20 minutes or we'd definitely get sued. I wheeled the cake in through the service entrance trying to be invisible, but the kitchen staff looked panicked and one server was actually crying. The cake table was in the main reception hall where the groom was now yelling at his mother while his mother yelled at the bride's mother, and the bride sobbed in the corner surrounded by bridesmaids. I stood there holding this massive cake on a cart, trapped because they were blocking the only path to the table. "Excuse me," I whispered, but nobody heard me over the screaming. The groom was saying something about his mother-in-law's speech, and the bride's mother was threatening to leave and take half the guests with her. I tried to roll the cake around them, but the best man grabbed my shoulder and asked if I thought the groom was overreacting. I just shook my head and kept moving, but then he followed me, drunk and rambling about how the bride had been cheating with her personal trainer. I finally got to the cake table and started the delicate process of transferring each tier while the fight escalated behind me. The bride had stopped crying and started screaming back, something about the groom's secretary, and then I heard glass shatter. A champagne flute had hit the wall 3 feet from where I was standing, and tiny shards sprinkled onto the cake table. I picked them off with tweezers while my hands shook, because if there was glass in the cake, we'd lose our business license. The photographer rushed over demanding I move the cake to better lighting, but I couldn't move it now that it was assembled. She started arguing with me while the bride and groom's fight moved closer. The groom knocked over the gift table and presents scattered everywhere. The bride screamed that the wedding was off and started pulling at her dress like she was going to rip it off right there. I had the cake assembled and was backing away when the maid of honor grabbed me and started sobbing into my shirt about her non-refundable dress. I tried to extract myself, but she had fistfuls of my uniform and wouldn't let go. Behind her, the groom had picked up a chair and was holding it over his head while his groomsmen tried to calm him down. The bride was throwing her bouquet at him repeatedly, screaming with each throw. The DJ tried playing music to calm everyone, but that made it worse because the bride screamed it was their song and collapsed to the floor. The groom dropped the chair and ran to her. I used that moment to break free and head for the exit, but the mother of the bride intercepted me, demanding to know if the cake was gluten-free because her sister was celiac. I stammered that I just delivered it while she got increasingly hysterical about attempted murder. The venue coordinator appeared screaming about insurance liability, while behind her, the wedding party had started taking sides, squaring off like some kind of civil war. The flower girl was crying and threw her basket at the ring bearer who threw the pillow back, rings flying somewhere under the tables. My van was blocked in by catering trucks and a limo parked sideways across the service road. I went back inside to find someone with keys and walked straight into the officiant who grabbed my arm asking if I'd witnessed the ceremony because he needed to know if it was legally binding before they divorced. The bride's father was threatening to call his lawyer, while the groom's father threatened to call his better lawyer. The bride and groom suddenly stopped fighting and both turned to stare at the cake. They walked toward it together, and I felt relief thinking maybe the cake would save the wedding, but the bride was saying the roses were the wrong shade of pink. The groom was measuring the tears, saying they looked uneven. They both turned to me at the same time, and I saw something shift in their faces, like they'd found a common enemy. "You," the bride said, mascara streaming down her face. "You ruined everything. The cake was late, and now look what happened." The groom stepped closer, still holding a champagne bottle by the neck. "She's right. This is your fault. Everything was perfect until you showed up." I stepped backward, but hit the cake table and froze as they both moved toward me. The groom raised the champagne bottle higher, and the entire wedding party turned to watch what would happen next. My hands fumbled for my phone in my pocket while trying to keep my eyes on both of them. The bride grabbed my arm and yanked me forward while the groom circled around to block my exit path. I pulled out my phone and started taking photos of the cake as fast as I could. The flash went off and lit up the perfect pink roses and the completely level tears. The bride screamed at me to stop taking pictures and lunged for my phone, but I twisted away. I kept snapping photos while backing around the table, getting every angle of the undamaged cake. The groom tried to grab my phone too, but I shoved it in my pocket and ran toward the kitchen. The venue coordinator was by the service door making frantic phone calls about liability insurance. I waved the delivery form at her, but she turned away and kept talking about coverage limits. I tried to tap her shoulder, but she walked outside still on her phone. The form crumpled in my sweaty hand as more shouting erupted behind me in the reception hall. I pulled out my phone again and called my boss, praying he'd pick up this time. He answered on the 5th ring, and I could barely understand his slurred words over the background noise of a bar. I told him they were blaming me for ruining the wedding, and he just laughed and said no refunds. When I explained about the champagne bottle and the threats, the line went dead. A guest shoved a phone in my face and started recording while telling me I was the worst vendor she'd ever seen. She followed me as I tried to get away, narrating to her camera about unprofessional cake delivery people. I worried about the video ending up online and destroying the bakery's reputation, even though none of this was my fault. Behind her, one of the servers was picking up broken glass and suddenly cried out in pain. Blood dripped from his hand onto the white tablecloth just 3 feet from the cake table. I grabbed napkins from the bar and ran over to help while trying to keep the blood away from the cake area. He pressed the napkins against the cut, but blood soaked through them immediately and dripped onto the floor. I knew if any blood got near the cake, it would become a health code violation that could shut us down. The venue coordinator finally came back inside and saw the bleeding server near the cake. She pointed at me and demanded I move the cake immediately because it was now a liability issue. I explained that moving it after assembly would make it collapse, but she kept insisting and threatening to call the police. The 3 tiers were too delicate to move safely, and the bottom tier alone weighed 40 pounds. She grabbed one side of the table and started pulling while I held the other side to keep it steady. The cake wobbled dangerously, and frosting cracked along the second tier, but she wouldn't stop pulling. The groom suddenly broke away from his groomsman and charged straight at the cake with both hands extended. His groomsman grabbed him just as his fingers brushed the bottom tier and left marks in the frosting. My heart pounded as I positioned myself between him and the cake while he struggled against his friends. He kept screaming that he'd destroy it and make me pay for ruining his wedding day. The bride's mother pushed through the crowd and stuck her face inches from mine. She said the roses were obviously salmon-colored, not pink, and demanded a full refund immediately. She took close-up photos with her phone while listing every website where she'd post 1-star reviews. Her hands shook with rage as she typed on her phone, already starting her first review. The photographer appeared at my other side and grabbed my sleeve, insisting I move the cake to better lighting. She said if I didn't move it right now, she'd tag the bakery in every negative post she made. I tried to explain again that assembled cakes couldn't be moved safely, but she kept pulling on my arm. The venue coordinator was still trying to drag the table while the photographer pulled me the opposite direction. More guests had their phones out now, recording everything while the chaos got worse around us. The bleeding server had wandered too close to the cake trying to find more napkins for his hand. A drop of blood fell and landed on the white tablecloth an inch from the cake stand. I dove forward with napkins to cover it before anyone noticed, but knocked into the bride's mother. She screamed that I'd assaulted her and started calling 911 on her phone. The groom broke free again and got within a foot of the cake before being tackled by the best man. They crashed into the gift table and more presents scattered across the floor, breaking whatever was inside. The DJ started playing music at maximum volume trying to drown out the screaming, but it just made everything more chaotic. The bride ripped off her veil and threw it at me, screaming that I'd destroyed her life. There's something really strange about how quickly they turned on the cake delivery person when they were just fighting each other seconds before. Makes me wonder if this couple always needs someone to blame when things go wrong. The flower girl started crying again and threw her remaining petals at everyone within reach. I tried to edge toward the exit, but found myself completely surrounded by angry wedding guests recording me. My uniform was soaked with sweat and the maid of honor's tears from earlier, and now had blood on it too. The cake still stood perfectly assembled on its table, the only thing in the room that wasn't destroyed yet. The double doors burst open, and 2 security guards rushed in with police officers right behind them. One officer raised his hand and announced nobody could leave until they gave statements about the incident. My heart sank because my van was still blocked by that limo anyway. The officer started taking names while his partner radioed for backup. I edged toward him to ask about moving the vehicles, but he held up a finger to wait. The bride's mother was screaming at him about false imprisonment, while the groom's father threatened to call the mayor. More guests crowded around, recording everything on their phones. I finally got close enough to tap the officer's shoulder. He turned and I asked if someone could move the limo blocking the service road. He shook his head and said all vehicles had to stay put for the investigation. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I needed air but couldn't leave without my delivery form signed. The kitchen staff appeared from the service hallway looking relieved the cops were here. The head server grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the kitchen. She pointed at the cake and said since the reception was ruined anyway, I should just cut it now. I shook my head and explained my contract only covered delivery, not serving. She got angry and said the cake would go to waste. I pulled out my phone and showed her the contract terms. She stormed off muttering about useless vendors. The best man stumbled over again with a fresh drink in his hand. He leaned too close and his breath reeked of whiskey. He started rambling about how the groom had been sleeping with his secretary for 6 months. He laughed and said that made them even since the bride was cheating too. I tried to step away, but he followed me. He kept saying everyone knew about both affairs except the couple themselves. I spotted someone across the room holding up their phone and talking loudly. They were live streaming the whole disaster, and I heard them say the wedding planner had ruined everything. They pointed the camera at me and announced I was the planner who destroyed the wedding. Comments started flooding the screen, blaming me for the chaos. I waved my hands trying to signal I was just the cake delivery person, but they kept filming. The flower girl and ring bearer suddenly ran up to me holding something shiny. They'd found the wedding rings under a table and brought them to me for some reason. The bride's father saw this and started yelling that I'd stolen the rings. The groom's mother joined in saying she saw me near the gift table earlier. I held up the rings trying to explain the kids just gave them to me. Nobody listened, and more phones turned in my direction. I set the rings on the nearest table and backed away. That's when I noticed the cake starting to lean to one side. The table wasn't level and the weight was shifting. I rushed over and grabbed napkins to shove under the table leg. Everyone stopped yelling to watch me scramble around the cake. Some guests actually looked disappointed when I managed to stabilize it. The venue coordinator finally appeared with my delivery paperwork. She signed it, but wrote a long note about an incident occurring during delivery. I didn't care anymore and just wanted to leave. I grabbed the signed form and headed for the service entrance. The bride suddenly appeared in front of me, blocking the doorway. She clutched her stomach and claimed the cake made her sick. I pointed out nobody had eaten any cake yet. She insisted the smell alone was making making her nauseous, and she'd sue for poisoning. Her bridesmaids surrounded me, nodding and agreeing with everything she said. One claimed she felt dizzy just looking at the cake. Another said the frosting looked contaminated. I tried to push past them, but they formed a wall. The groom wandered over, still carrying that champagne bottle. He swayed on his feet and got way too close to the cake table. I abandoned my escape attempt and moved between him and the cake. He tried to go around me, but I kept blocking him. The last thing I needed was him destroying the evidence that the cake was fine. He finally gave up and stumbled toward the bar instead. The police officer from earlier walked over with his notepad out. He needed my statement about what I'd witnessed. I explained I just delivered a cake and got caught in the middle. He wrote everything down while the families kept interrupting with their own versions. The bride claimed I'd been late, and that started the whole fight. The groom said I'd brought the wrong cake flavor. Neither was true, but the officer kept writing. I showed him my delivery slip with the correct timestamp. He compared it to the venue's security log and confirmed I'd arrived on time. The bride's mother snatched the paper, claiming it was forged. The officer took it back and told her to calm down. More police arrived and started separating the wedding parties. They moved the bride's side to one end of the hall and the groom's to the other. I stood in the middle, still trapped with no way to leave. The head of security announced they'd be reviewing surveillance footage. Everyone suddenly got quiet, realizing their behavior was all on camera. The venue coordinator whispered that the cameras caught everything, including the initial fight. The bride and groom looked at each other across the room. For a second, I thought they might reconcile, but then they both started texting frantically, probably calling lawyers based on the grim expressions. The groom was still holding that champagne bottle when he stumbled backward into the cake table, and the bottle tipped forward. Golden liquid splashed across the bottom tier and soaked right into the white fondant. I grabbed napkins from the nearest table and started blotting while the stains spread like a disease across the perfect white surface. My decorating kit was still in the van, so I ran back through the service entrance and grabbed my emergency supplies. The fondant was already getting sticky and soft where the champagne hit, but I had some extra white icing in a tube. I smoothed it over the damaged spot and used my offset spatula to blend the edges while everyone kept screaming at each other behind me. The repair wasn't perfect, but from a few feet away you couldn't tell unless you knew where to look. My phone buzzed with a text from my boss, asking why the hell I was still at the venue when the delivery should have taken 20 minutes max. I typed back that the police were here and nobody could leave, but he immediately called me a liar and said he'd dock my pay for every extra minute I was there. Another text came through saying I better not have damaged the van or eaten any of the leftover cake samples in the back. I wanted to throw my phone at the wall, but instead I remembered we kept delivery contracts in the glove compartment for situations exactly like this. The van was still blocked in, but I squeezed through the catering trucks to get to it and found our standard contract with the liability clause highlighted in yellow. It said clear as day that once the cake was delivered and set up, any damage was the client's responsibility. I took photos of that section with my phone and also grabbed the signed copy from this morning when the bride's mother had picked up the cake topper. The venue coordinator appeared at my elbow looking frazzled and asked if I could help move the cake to the storage room since the reception obviously wasn't happening now. She said they needed to clear the space for the police investigation and the cake couldn't stay where it was. I looked at the 3 tiers still stacked and thought about how one wrong bump could send the whole thing crashing down. But if I refused to help and something happened to it later, they'd probably blame me anyway. We found a cart in the kitchen and I carefully transferred the cake board onto it while she held it steady. The wheels squeaked as we rolled it through the reception hall where half the guests were giving statements to police and the other half were stealing centerpieces. We had to go around overturned chairs and broken glass and at one point navigate between the mothers who were now in their own screaming match about whose family was more dysfunctional. The cart hit a bump where the carpet met the tile floor and I saw the middle tier shift about an inch to the left. My heart stopped, but I managed to grab it with both hands and ease it back into position. Now there was a visible crack in the icing where the tiers had separated and shifted. I used my finger to smooth some extra icing into the crack, but you could still see the line if you looked close enough. The storage room was cramped and smelled like cleaning supplies, but at least the cake was safe from flying champagne bottles and fistfights. I took photos from every angle showing the cake was mostly intact, despite everything that had happened. The timestamp on the photos would prove when they were taken and that the major damage happened after delivery. A police officer found me in the storage room and said he needed my statement about what I'd witnessed. I stuck to just the facts about arriving with the cake, setting it up and trying to leave when the fight broke out. He wrote everything down in a little notebook and seemed tired, like he'd dealt with wedding disasters before. He said this was going to be a mess for everyone involved and the venue would probably press charges for property damage. I gave him my contact information and he said the bakery might need to provide additional statements later. I'm really curious how the cake survived all that chaos when everything else got destroyed. The way everyone kept blaming the delivery person for different things is so interesting. Like, how did they all decide this was somehow their fault? Walking back through the venue to check if the parking lot was clear yet, I passed the bride surrounded by her bridesmaids in what used to be the cocktail hour space. She was telling them the groom couldn't last more than 2 minutes in bed and always cried afterward. In the next room, the groom was with his groomsmen saying the bride had maxed out 3 credit cards without telling him and had been texting her ex the whole engagement. Both groups were drunk and getting louder with each revelation. The photographer approached me while I was waiting by the service door and pulled me aside. She said she'd been taking pictures the whole time and had clear shots of the cake being perfect when I delivered it. She had timestamps on everything and offered to send them to me as evidence. She seemed to understand I was just the delivery person caught in the middle of this disaster and felt felt bad for me. Her camera had caught the moment the groom knocked into the table and the champagne spilled, plus all the other damage that happened after. She gave me her business card and said to have my boss contact her if he needed witness statements. The police were finally done with their initial investigation and started letting cars leave the parking lot. The catering trucks pulled out first, then the limo that had been blocking everyone else. I'd been trapped at this nightmare wedding for 3 hours when it should have been a quick 20-minute delivery. The officer who took my statement gave me a case number and said the bakery would probably be contacted by insurance companies and possibly lawyers. He wished me luck and said I should document everything I could remember while it was still fresh. I sat in my van for a minute before driving away, looking at the venue where people were still yelling and crying and throwing things. The drive back to the bakery took 40 minutes and my phone started buzzing before I even got on the highway. My boss was calling, but I couldn't answer while driving, so I let it go to voicemail 5 times before he started texting in all caps about needing an immediate report. When I finally pulled into a gas station to call him back, he was already drunk again and shouting that I needed to write up how the venue damaged the cake during setup. I told him that wasn't what happened, and he got quiet for a second before saying, I better think real hard about my job security. He wanted me to say the venue staff knocked into the cart and caused the glass contamination, but I couldn't put lies in writing that could get us sued for fraud. He hung up on me when I refused and sent 17 more texts demanding the false report by midnight. I drove the rest of the way home trying not to think about losing my job, but knowing I couldn't write what he wanted. That night I was heating up leftover pasta when my roommate showed me her phone, and there I was in the background of some wedding guest's TikTok, standing frozen with the cake while the bride screamed at the groom. The video already had 200,000 views, and people in the comments were trying to figure out what bakery I worked for based on my uniform. Within an hour, 3 more videos from different angles went viral, and someone had identified our bakery logo on my shirt. The bakery's Instagram got flooded with 1-star reviews from people who'd never even been customers, calling us incompetent and saying we ruined weddings. My boss called me screaming at 11 p.m. because corporate was threatening to revoke his franchise license over the social media disaster. The next morning, I woke up to 14 missed calls from an unknown number that turned out to be the county health department. The inspector said they'd received multiple reports about glass contamination at a catered event and needed all documentation about our involvement immediately. I explained we only delivered a cake, and I had photos showing it was intact when I left, but she said they still needed to investigate since our business was named in the complaints. She wanted delivery receipts, preparation logs, ingredient lists, and a written statement about everything I witnessed. My boss called while I was gathering the paperwork and started yelling that this was all my fault for not leaving the cake and running when things got bad. He said any delivery driver with sense would have abandoned the venue instead of standing around like an idiot while everything fell apart. I reminded him he'd begged me to make sure the delivery was perfect because they were lawsuit happy, but he said that didn't mean I should have stayed 3 hours. He kept repeating that I let the situation get out of hand, even though all I did was deliver a cake and try to leave. The health inspector showed up at the bakery that afternoon with a clipboard and started examining everything in the kitchen. She made us throw out 3 sheet cakes that were cooling on racks because they might have been exposed to glass particles, even though the glass incident happened 20 miles away at the venue. We lost $200 in ingredients plus the labor time, and she kept finding more things that had to be discarded just in case. My boss followed her around trying to convince her nothing was contaminated, but she said we couldn't take chances with public safety. During the inspection, my boss pulled me aside and whispered that I should tell her I never saw any glass near the cake at all. He said if I just denied seeing anything, we could avoid any liability and blame everything on the venue's poor management. But when the inspector asked me directly, I told her the truth about the champagne glass breaking near the table and how I'd picked fragments off with tweezers. My boss's face turned red and he stormed into his office, slamming the door so hard the inspector wrote him up for unprofessional conduct. She thanked me for being honest and said it actually helped our case since I'd taken precautions to protect the cake. That evening, I got an email from the venue coordinator with a carefully worded request for a written statement about what I'd witnessed. She wanted me to emphasize how chaotic the wedding party was and downplay any venue responsibility, basically asking me to throw the bride and groom under the bus. But then I noticed she'd attached my delivery form with her signature confirming the cake arrived on time and intact, which was exactly the proof I needed. I wrote back saying I'd provide an honest statement that included the fact that she'd signed for the delivery without any complaints. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived at the bakery from the law offices of someone representing the bride and groom. They claimed we'd delivered the cake late, even though I had time-stamped photos and the signed receipt, and they said the roses were the wrong shade of pink, which wasn't even something we controlled since they'd approved the design. They wanted a full refund of the $800 cake plus $5,000 in emotional distress damages for ruining their special day. My boss threw the letter at me and said I should pay it myself since I caused all this trouble. Our insurance company assigned an adjuster who called me the next day wanting every single detail about the delivery and the 3 hours I was trapped there. I sent her all my photos with timestamps, the delivery receipt the venue coordinator signed, copies of my texts to my boss asking for help, and even the police report number. She said my documentation was excellent, and it was clear we'd fulfilled our contract, but the claim would still take weeks to resolve. My boss decided to punish me by cutting my hours from 40 a week to 20, saying he couldn't afford full-time employees who caused legal problems. I started looking for other jobs immediately, but needed the income, so I had to accept the reduced schedule and pretend everything was fine. 2 days into my new schedule, the photographer from from the wedding emailed me a link to download the professional photos she'd taken. She said she thought I might need them for legal purposes and wanted to help since I'd been so professional during the chaos. I clicked through hundreds of photos showing the perfect three-tier cake sitting on the table before everything went wrong. The timestamp on each photo proved we'd delivered on time and the cake looked exactly like what they'd ordered. Then I found the photos from after the champagne bottle incident and my stomach dropped. One shot clearly showed the damaged bottom tier with frosting smeared and flowers knocked off where the bottle had hit. The photographer had accidentally captured the whole thing in the background while taking photos of the dance floor. I forwarded everything to our insurance company immediately. The claims adjuster called me back within an hour saying these photos were exactly what they needed. She said they showed we'd delivered the cake perfectly and any damage happened after we'd completed our contract. A week later, the insurance company sent a letter saying they'd offer the couple a partial settlement to make the whole thing go away. The settlement was less than what they were demanding, but enough to avoid a lawsuit. My boss called me into his office waving the letter around. He said the bakery still had to pay a $1,000 deductible because of my incompetence. I tried to explain that the photos proved we'd done everything right, but he cut me off. He said he'd be taking $50 out of each paycheck until the deductible was paid back. I did the math and realized that would take 5 months with my reduced hours. I signed the paper he shoved at me because I needed the job while I looked for something better. The next morning, we got a visit from the health department. Someone had reported seeing glass in the wedding cake on social media. The inspector spent 3 hours going through our kitchen and reviewing our procedures. She found several minor violations that had nothing to do with the wedding, but said she had to document everything. Something doesn't add up about the boss taking money from paychecks for the deductible. That seems legally questionable at best. The photographer's evidence clearly shows the bakery did nothing wrong, yet here's this employee getting punished for documenting the truth instead of lying like. We got an official warning letter, but they didn't suspend our license. The inspector said we were lucky, but we'd have to implement new delivery protocols immediately. My boss had to create a whole checklist system for deliveries that added at least 30 minutes to every order. Drivers now had to take photos at every stage, get signatures at multiple points, and document the condition of the venue before setup. It turned simple deliveries into complicated productions. 3 weeks after the wedding, the viral videos finally stopped circulating, but the damage was done. Our online reviews tanked from 4.5 stars to 2 stars. Regular customers who'd been coming for years stopped ordering. Mrs. Yardy, who got a birthday cake every month for her grandkids, hadn't called once. The coffee shop that ordered pastries twice a week switched to another bakery. My boss blamed me every time an order got canceled, even though most customers explicitly mentioned seeing the wedding videos. He'd walk past me in the kitchen and mutter about how one person could destroy 20 years of reputation. We barely spoke beyond him giving me delivery addresses and me confirming pickup times. He stopped making eye contact and would leave the room when I entered. The other employees felt the tension and started avoiding both of us. The woman who decorated cakes told me she was sorry about everything but couldn't risk taking sides. Even with fewer orders, I was only getting my 20 hours a week while everyone else kept their full schedules. 4 weeks after the wedding, our lawyer called with unexpected news. The couple was getting divorced and their lawyers had bigger problems than our cake. The bride's attorney sent a notice saying they were dropping the case against us. Apparently, the bride and groom couldn't agree on whether to pursue the lawsuit since they were now fighting over everything else. The lawyer said this was the best possible outcome for us. My boss actually smiled when he heard, but still didn't increase my hours. That same day, I got an email from the venue coordinator. She thanked me for maintaining my professionalism during what she called the most insane wedding she'd seen in 30 years. She said she'd been in the business long enough to recognize when someone was scapegoated. She offered to be a reference if I ever needed one, and mentioned she knew people at several catering companies. I took that as my sign to seriously start job hunting. I applied to 15 places that week. Most didn't respond, but 3 called me for interviews. The first 2 went nowhere once they Googled my name and found the wedding videos. The third was a corporate catering company that delivered to the office buildings and events. The manager had already seen the videos before I came in. She said she was impressed that I'd managed to set up the cake perfectly despite the chaos. She asked me to explain exactly what happened and actually listen to my side. They offered me the job on the spot with better pay and benefits. The company had real delivery protocols and a legal team on retainer for difficult clients. My last week at the bakery dragged on forever. On my final Thursday, my boss finally talked to me beyond work stuff. He stood in the doorway of the break room and said maybe he shouldn't have sent me alone to such an important delivery. He said he'd been stressed about money and made a bad call. It was too little too late, but at least he said it. I just nodded and went back to loading the van for my last delivery. My new job started the following Monday. The first thing they showed me was their delivery system where drivers always worked in pairs for large orders. They had lawyers on retainer specifically for problem clients. Every vehicle had cameras, and every delivery required extensive documentation. The training manager said they'd learned the hard way that some clients would blame vendors for anything that went wrong. Looking at their procedures made me realize how badly my old boss had been running things all along. 6 months later, I was grabbing coffee downtown when someone called my name, and I turned to see the venue coordinator from that wedding walking toward me with her own drink. She sat down at my table and immediately started telling me how that whole disaster had changed their business policies completely. They now had a rule where no deliveries could happen if there was an active dispute happening between the wedding party because of what went down that day. She pulled out her phone and showed me the actual written policy they'd put in their contracts with the words, "No vendor shall shall enter premises during domestic altercation, highlighted in yellow. Then she leaned in closer and told me the bride had tried to sue basically everyone after the wedding fell apart. The venue got sued, the photographer got sued, the DJ got sued, even the florist got a legal notice. But none of the lawsuits went anywhere because there was so much video from guests' phones showing the bride and groom starting every single fight themselves. The judge threw out all the cases and made them pay court costs. My phone buzzed while we were talking, and it was a text from my old boss at the bakery asking if I wanted my job back. He said he couldn't find anyone reliable to do deliveries and would give me a raise if I came back. I texted him back that I had a better job now and reminded him he still owed me $300 from when he took money out of my paycheck for that stupid lawsuit that never even happened. He didn't respond after that. The corporate catering company I worked for now was way less personal than the bakery, but everything ran so much smoother. I delivered to the office parties and business lunches where people just wanted their food on time, and nobody ever threw champagne at anything. The trucks had GPS tracking and cameras, and every delivery got signed for with timestamps. Sometimes when I was bored at home, I'd check the bakery's online reviews just to see how they were doing. They never really bounced back from that wedding disaster, even though it wasn't really their fault. The reviews kept mentioning late deliveries and wrong orders, and the rating had dropped from 4 stars to barely 2. Part of me felt bad seeing them struggle, but then I'd remember how my old boss had thrown me under the bus. At the catering company break room one day, my coworkers were swapping stories about their worst deliveries, and when it was my turn, I told them about the wedding. They all thought I was making it up, or at least exaggerating until I pulled up the news articles on my phone. The wedding had gone viral as "Wedding from Hell Caught on Camera," and there were even reaction videos on YouTube of people watching the footage. One coworker asked if I ever found out what started the whole fight, and I told them about the personal trainer and the secretary accusations, but honestly, it seemed like those two had been looking for reasons to blow up at each other. That whole experience taught me to always document everything with photos and timestamps, to stand my ground when someone tries to blame me for their problems, and most importantly, to recognize when a workplace is toxic and get out before it gets worse. The wedding disaster actually did me a favor by forcing me to find a better job with a company that had their act together. Just last week, my old boss texted me again, but this time it wasn't asking me to come back. He was letting me know the bakery was closing down for good at the end of the month. Reading that text, I realized how close I'd come to being stuck there when it went under. Getting fired over that wedding was the best thing that could have happened because it pushed me to find something better before the whole place collapsed. Thanks for exploring all these questions with me today. I had a great time wondering through everything with you. Until we meet again, like the video, it helps more than you think.